Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful for You channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Forrester had been preparing for this moment long before anyone at Forrester Creations realized something colossal was brewing, but the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface finally erupted the moment she walked into the executive suite that morning, heels clicking like the opening beat of a warning drum, eyes sharp with the kind of determination that never appeared unless she'd already made up her mind, and the employees scattered along the hallway could feel the shift in the air as if the entire building had leaned in to witness the fallout of whatever power move she was about to unleash. The truth was, Steffi had been watching Daphne unravel the trust and structure Forrester relied on, not in loud, explosive ways but in subtle, corrosive ones, a misplaced account file here, a mishandled meeting there, a few too many decisions made behind closed doors without looping in the right people, decisions that, if allowed to continue, could have sent the entire company spiraling into another PR nightmare at a time when they desperately needed unity, not chaos, and Steffi, who had fought too hard to re-establish the integrity and stability of the brand after months of personal and professional turbulence, refused to let anyone jeopardize what the Forresters had rebuilt. Yet the real turning point, the real moment Steffi knew she had to take decisive action, was the instant she discovered Daphne had been quietly redirecting resources meant for the Hope for the Future relaunch, resources that Hope Logan had unknowingly been waiting for, hoping for, praying for in quiet moments when she doubted whether her line had any real future left under the current regime, and the betrayal ignited a fire in Steffi that burned hotter with every passing hour until finally she decided there was no salvaging this situation, not for Daphne, not for the team, not for the Forrester name, and especially not for Hope, whose return to the company was already fragile, emotionally loaded, and tangled with more history than most people could carry in a lifetime. That morning, when Steffi summoned everyone to the office for what she called a mandatory leadership alignment meeting, no one could have predicted the scale of the shakeup she was orchestrating, but the second Daphne walked in, slightly late, trying to mask her nervousness with a bright smile and overcompensating posture, Hope immediately sensed something was off. The air felt thick, the silence too still, and even Ridge, standing with his arms crossed, looked like he was bracing himself for impact. With a calmness that made the tension even more terrifying, Steffi began addressing the room, her tone professional but icy, outlining how Forrester Creations was entering a new era of transparency, collaboration, and accountability, emphasizing the responsibility of leadership to uphold the company's vision, its culture, and its promises. And it was when she uttered the words mismanagement, breach of trust, and undermining core operations that Daphne's composure finally cracked, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for someone, anyone, to step in and defend her, but no one moved, not even Ridge, not even Thomas, not even the assistants or coordinators who usually stayed neutral when the higher-ups clashed. And then, in one clean, devastating sentence, Steffi cut the cord, announcing that Daphne was being relieved of her duties effective immediately, and the room fell into a shocked stillness broken only by the tiny, shaky inhale Daphne made before trying to argue, desperately insisting she'd been doing what she thought was best for the brand, claiming she'd acted on creative instinct, that she was just trying to protect the company from another financial liability. But Steffi didn't flinch. She had the receipts, the documentation, the timeline, the emails, and the proof that Daphne's so-called protective moves weren't protective at all but self-serving, territorial, and deliberately obstructive, especially where Hope was concerned. And Hope, standing there listening to Daphne's frantic excuses, felt a pang of sympathy at first. She knew what it was like to be blamed, cornered, misunderstood, and publicly humiliated in that office, but the sympathy faded when she remembered the months of stalled approvals, the unexplained budget reductions, the sudden reassignments of her dedicated team members, the cancellations of meetings, all of which she now understood had been orchestrated to sabotage the relaunch of Hope for the Future, the line that carried not just her name but her heart, her identity, and her connection to the Forrester legacy. So Hope stood silently, watching Steffi reclaim control in a way that was fierce but fair, firm but grounded, and when Daphne finally realized she had no support, no allies, no path forward, she turned to Hope as a last resort, her voice trembling as she asked if Hope would speak up on her behalf, if She could at least acknowledge that she hadn't been the villain everyone was painting her to be, but Hope, gentle, compassionate, soft-spoken Hope, could only shake her head, unable to rewrite the reality that had shaped her recent struggles, and Daphne's face crumpled with the weight of the truth she could no longer outrun. After security escorted Daphne out of the building, a quiet, almost merciful exit compared to the explosive confrontations that had unfolded in that office. Over the years, Steffi took a long moment to breathe, not because she doubted her decision but because firing anyone, even someone who had caused so much damage, was never easy, never simple, and never without emotional consequence, and the room remained silent until Rich finally stepped forward, placing a steady hand on his daughter's shoulder and telling her she had done what needed to be done, that she had acted like a true leader. And for the first time in a long while, Steffi felt the full weight of the CEO role settle on her shoulders in a way that was strangely empowering instead of overwhelming. Then she turned to Hope, not with animosity, not with rivalry, but with a sincere, level acknowledgement that Hope deserved better than what she had been given recently, and Steffi announced that Hope for the future would not only be reinstated but prioritized, revitalized, and properly funded, and Hope, caught between shock and cautious gratitude, felt something that had been missing for months return, a sense of purpose, of belonging, of possibility, and maybe even of trust, fragile but real. As the meeting continued, Steffi outlined her vision for the relaunch, inviting Hope to speak freely about her goals, her creative direction, her concerns, and Hope, surprised at the sincerity of the gesture, found herself opening up, sharing ideas she had kept locked away out of fear that they would never be heard or valued again, and the team, Thomas included, listened with a level of respect and renewed interest that filled the room with a quiet but potent spark of optimism. Outside the office, the Forrester staff buzzed with rumors, whispers, and shockwaves, because Daphne being fired was more than a personnel change, it was a statement, a declaration that Steffi was no longer willing to tolerate internal sabotage or creative suppression, that she was ready to step into her power with clarity and conviction, and that the days of silent battles and whispered compromises were over. Meanwhile, Daphne, sitting alone in her car in the parking garage, processed the sudden implosion of the world she had built for herself at Forrester, replaying every decision, every moment she crossed a line she thought no one would notice, every warning she ignored, and as she fought back tears of frustration, fear, and disbelief, she also felt the sting of regret, not because she thought Steffi was wrong, but because deep down she knew she had let ambition warp her judgment, had let insecurity push her into actions she could never take back, and the realization settled on her like a cold shadow as she finally drove away from the building that had once felt like her entire future. Back upstairs, Steffi and Hope continued discussing the next steps for their unexpected alliance, an alliance rooted not in sisterly affection or long-buried rivalry but in mutual respect and a shared desire to protect the legacy of the company their families had built. And as they reviewed sketches, fabrics, and marketing projections, something shifted between them, something small but significant, a recognition that they didn't have to be enemies, that they could coexist without tearing each other down, that they might even create something extraordinary together, and Ridge watched them with a look of cautious hope, aware that the history between the Logans and Forresters was too deep and too complicated to ever disappear entirely, but also aware that sometimes a single change, a single firing, a single bold decision could rewrite the entire trajectory of the company and the people within it. As the day progressed, the buzz surrounding Daphne's dismissal spread beyond Forrester Creations, leaking into the fashion world, hitting social media, fueling speculation among influencers and industry insiders, with some praising Steffi's strong leadership and others warning of potential backlash. But Steffi remained unfazed. She had made the right call for the company, and whatever waves it created, she would ride them with the same confidence she used to navigate every storm she'd survived. Hope, realizing her return was real, not symbolic, felt a swell of excitement mixed with nerves, imagining the new future of Hope for the future, imagining herself stepping back into her creative identity with more clarity and conviction than ever before, and though she didn't say it out loud, a small part of her wondered if this new chapter might also mean healing, for herself, for Steffi, for the entire fractured dynamic that had defined their lives for so long. And by the time the sun began setting over Los Angeles, casting a warm golden glow across the glass walls of Forrester Creations, Steffi stood in her office alone for a moment, looking out over the city and letting the events of the day sink in, knowing this was just the beginning. That Daphne's firing was merely the first domino in a long chain of changes that needed to happen, and that Hope's return, while promising, would bring its own set of challenges, surprises, and emotional reckonings. But for the first time in a long time, Steffi felt ready, prepared, and powerful, and as she exhaled slowly, she whispered to herself that the new chapter had officially begun, one that would reshape alliances, redefine rivalries, and push Forrester Creations into a future that no one, not even her, could fully predict. But one thing was certain, the shakeup had only just begun, and the aftershocks would be felt far beyond the walls of the office where it all started. But the real aftermath of Daphne's firing didn't unfold inside the polished walls of Forrester Creations. It began the moment Daphne walked into her apartment hours later, the silence collapsing on her like a physical weight, because for the first time since she'd arrived in Los Angeles, she wasn't the rising star, the respected creative, the woman with momentum and influence. She was unemployed, disgraced, and painfully aware that the fashion world was small enough for news like this to travel at lightning speed, and she could already imagine the whispers forming in every design room from Beverly Hills to Paris, whispers questioning her creativity, her professionalism, her motives, whispers that would eventually harden into a narrative she had no control over. As she sank onto her couch, replaying Steffi's words in her mind, bitterness rose in her chest until it felt like pressure behind her ribs, because yes, she had made questionable decisions, yes, she'd acted out of fear and insecurity, but she also believed, truly believed, that she had been protecting the company from a creative direction she felt was outdated, stagnant, and resting too heavily on legacy instead of innovation, and now she wondered if any of that mattered or if she had simply become another casualty in the endless Logan Forrester war that had claimed so many careers before hers. Meanwhile, back at Forrester, the ripple effects of Steffi's decision were beginning to take on a life of their own. Board members were calling for clarification, investors wanted reassurance, and even though Steffi projected confidence publicly, she could feel the pressure building under the surface, pressure that whispered reminders of every time a CEO, Brooke, Ridge, Quinn, even Eric himself, had made one bold decision only to face consequences they never saw coming. Hope, still adjusting to her reinstated role, felt the weight of it too. She tried to focus on fabric samples and sketches, but her mind kept drifting back to the moment Daphne had turned toward her, eyes wet and pleading, and even though Hope knew she had done nothing wrong, a part of her wrestled with guilt because she'd once been the woman pushed aside, and she knew exactly how devastating it was to watch her career unravel in a single afternoon. Thomas noticed her distraction instantly, of course he did, and though he tried to be supportive, offering to help streamline her designs or handle the technical outlines for the relaunch, Hope sensed something deeper in his gaze, something complicated and dangerous, a blend of protectiveness, unresolved affection, and territorial instinct that reminded her how fragile their new normal truly was. But Steffi had no space for romantic subplots, not today, not while she was juggling public relations strategies, HR follow-ups, legal reviews, and a rapidly growing chatter online, chatter accusing her of everything from personal vendettas to misusing her power to destroy a promising young designer. And when social media accounts began creating exaggerated narratives, Steffi fires woman 2 give Logan favoritism. Daphne exposes Forrester corruption. Steffi realized Daphne was becoming a symbol, a rallying point for critics who had been waiting for the perfect moment to accuse Forrester Creations of nepotism and internal bias. And as the noise grew louder, Steffi's phone buzzed with messages from Paris, Milan, New York, people she respected, people who wanted answers. And she felt the familiar cold frustration settle into her bones because she had acted with integrity, but integrity didn't matter when perception could be manipulated. On the other side of the city, Daphne sat staring at her laptop, scrolling through comment after comment, watching her name trend, and the more she read, the more a spark of something sharp and hungry ignited within her, not humiliation, not defeat, but vengeance, a quiet, simmering resolve that maybe she wasn't done with Forrester Creations after all. Maybe her story wasn't meant to end on a humiliating note. Maybe there were truths she could expose, alliances she could leverage, or media outlets she could feed. And as she opened her email to find a message from a well-known fashion journalist requesting an exclusive statement, something in her hardened. Meanwhile, Hope was doing her best to stay centered, telling herself that focusing on her work was the only way forward, but as she moved through the design studio, gathering swatches, reviewing mood boards, and sketching quietly in the corner, she could feel Thomas's eyes tracking her every move, not possessively but intensely, almost as if he feared someone might take her away from him again. And though part of her appreciated the support, another part, the part that remembered manipulation, obsession, and heartbreak, felt the faintest tremor of unease, because no matter how much Thomas insisted he had changed, trauma had its own memory. Ridge, sensing the tension, called Steffi, Hope, and Thomas into the executive office for a late afternoon meeting, where he calmly but firmly told them that while Daphne's actions warranted her dismissal, the fallout could escalate quickly if they didn't handle the situation with precision, transparency, and unity, 3 things he knew the Forresters historically struggled with whenever personal feelings got involved. And as they talked strategy, public statements, internal memos, creative restructuring, updates for the board, Hope felt the strangest sensation, a blend of dread and excitement, because even though the moment was stressful, part of her loved being back in the fold, loved the energy of collaboration, loved feeling needed and valued again. But just as they were wrapping up the meeting, Carter walked in with a folder in his hand, his expression unreadable, and when he set the folder on the table, Steffi felt her stomach drop before he even opened his mouth. "You should see this," he said quietly, sliding it toward her, and when she skimmed the contents, the email timestamps, the archive pulls, the forwarded correspondences, her eyes widened with disbelief. Daphne hadn't just redirected resources or manipulated scheduling, she had accessed files she had no authorization to open, files related not only to Hope for the future but to private, internal Forrester financials, and suddenly Steffi realized this wasn't just mismanagement or sabotage, this was a potential legal issue, one that could explode into scandal if Daphne decided to weaponize it. She wasn't working alone, Carter added, and the room fell silent as he revealed that someone else, someone inside the company, had been sharing information with Daphne, and the moment he said it, the entire atmosphere shifted, thickening into suspicion, tension, and the cold recognition that Daphne's firing might have uncovered something far bigger than any of them imagined. And as the sun faded completely, leaving the building wrapped in twilight, Steffi knew the truth with bone-deep certainty: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But the storm truly began the following morning, long before Steffi or Hope stepped foot inside Forrester Creations, because the world outside had already woken up to a brand new headline, one that hit Steffi like a punch the moment her phone started vibrating nonstop at 6 a.m. Fired Forrester designer breaks silence, inside the toxic culture of FC. And it didn't take long for Steffi to realize exactly who had spoken, because Daphne's words were unmistakable, polished, strategic, wounded, and weaponized. She hadn't given a full interview, yet, but she had given enough to ignite speculation, enough to frame herself as a victim ousted for challenging the status quo, enough to imply the Logans received special treatment, and enough to cast doubt on Steffi's leadership without ever directly accusing her of wrongdoing. It was clever. Too clever. And Steffi felt the familiar burn of frustration rise in her chest as she read the carefully crafted statements that suggested impropriety without spelling anything out, statements that were almost impossible to challenge without exposing internal issues Steffi desperately needed to keep contained. By the time she arrived at the office, the building was already buzzing, assistants whispering in hallways, designers scrolling through gossip sites, marketing teams scrambling to adjust PR positioning, all while pretending everything was normal as if they didn't smell smoke rising from the edges of the company. Ridge was pacing the CEO office with Carter and Brooke inside, all of them mid-argument when Steffi walked in, and the look Ridge gave her said everything: "This is already bad, and it's getting worse." Brooke tried to reassure her, insisting publicly ignoring the situation was the smartest move, insisting Daphne was irrelevant now, but Steffi knew better. This wasn't a simple tantrum from a disgruntled ex-employee. This was a move. A setup. A warning shot. And Brooke's attempt to calm the room only irritated Steffi further, because in Brooke's voice she heard something she didn't want to address yet: Hope's name, floating silently beneath every comment, every sentence, every defense. Everyone knew the firing was tied to Hope's return. Everyone knew the optics would twist that fact whether it was fair or not. And Steffi could already sense the board's unspoken fear. The Forresters favor their own, the Logans are protected, the company is divided, leadership is compromised. But what happened next changed the tone of the entire situation. Carter placed a folder on the desk and told Ridge, Steffi, and Brooke that another email leak had occurred, only this time not to the press, but internally, forwarded to a private group thread among several mid-level employees. The email contained a partial screenshot of internal budget reallocations, real files, though taken out of context, paired with a caption implying financial misconduct. Not only that, the email had been sent anonymously. And this was the moment when Steffi felt something in her stomach tighten and drop, because anonymous internal sabotage meant that the mole Carter mentioned before wasn't a vague possibility or an overreaction. It was real. Someone inside Forrester was helping Daphne. Someone who still worked there. Hope walked in moments later, unaware of what she was stepping into, and the tension in the room shifted the air like a sudden drop in temperature. She immediately sensed it, everyone staring at her not with blame, but with the uneasy awareness that she was at the center of the brewing narrative whether she wanted to be or not. When Steffi explained the leaks, Hope's face went pale, because these weren't small issues, these were career-ruining, company-threatening landmines that could destroy Hope for the future again before it even relaunched. I didn't ask for this. I never would have wanted this, Hope insisted, voice tight, but Steffi shook her head. This wasn't about blame. This was about the reality. The firing had set off a chain reaction, and Hope's return to the company had become the emotional fuel behind it whether fair or not.